This comes from LA Times. And, we've talked about the mansion tax before, I believe. But,
Sure.
Darren, what's just kind of the basic? I'll go through the article, but what's the mansion tax? What are they trying to do here?
Two thresholds: threshold of 5 million, threshold of 10 million.
Mm-hmm.
Additional tax on top of the sale for each of the sales over that amount. And gosh, we're opening this article. I should know the numbers. They'll probably mention them here. But
Yeah,
it's like a couple points higher. I think it was like 4% and or 5% and 7%,
yeah,
somewhere in that range. It was a huge tax
yeah, yeah,
for selling. It had nothing to do with whether you're making money or not on the sale. It's just based on the sale price, and that was
yeah,
one of my biggest issues.
yeah.
Um, was just based on sale price. Labeling things just aren't that simple, man.
Right,
So,
right.
and as this article is going to reveal, when this
Mm.
passed, our city got very excited about where they were going to spend this money, and
Yeah.
that's what this article is jumping into.
Okay, well, let's take a look. As challenges loom, LA City Council approves a 150 million in mansion tax spending. So, nice graphic there. And let's see, this is latimes.com. The Los Angeles City Council passed a $150 million spending plan for funds raised by Measure ULA on Tuesday, marking the first time funds will be specifically allocated since Angelenos passed the tax in November. The expenditure plan will be directed to 6 programs: short-term emergency rental assistance, eviction defense, tenant outreach and education, direct cash assistance for low-income seniors and people with disabilities, tenant protections, and affordable housing production. This is the largest source of revenue that's going to be consistent that this city has access to for these uses ever, said Councilmember Nithya Raman. It's really transformative for Los Angeles. Of the 150 million, 23 million will go towards eviction defense, 23 million will go toward income support for rent-burdened seniors, and 18.4 million will go toward rent debt assistance. The first program to be implemented will be an emergency rental assistance program, which will open September 19th. Dubbed a mansion tax, Measure ULA took effect April 1, bringing a 4% charge on all residential and commercial real estate sales in the city above 5 million and a 5.5 charge on sales above 10 million. Since April, the tax has raised roughly 55 million. City officials said ULA money can be spent only as it comes in, so the city won't be able to use the full 150 million until the tax generates 150 million. Before the vote at Tuesday's meeting, about a dozen tenants and community activists expressed support for the funding, saying it is desperately needed, especially in the tenant outreach and eviction defense programs. I am excited that tenants will also have an opportunity to be legally represented in court and that landlords will not be the only ones with an attorney during an eviction, said Carolee De La Cruz, a civic engagement organizer with Trust South LA, because housing is a human right. We really need you all to pass the ULA plan today. That money belongs to the community, said Chad Williams, an LA organizer for the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. Joe Donlin, director of United to House LA, the coalition that brought Measure LA onto the ballot, vowed that the coalition will stand together during the implementation process to make sure every dollar is spent effectively. Famous last words. While 55 million is a significant amount of funding towards LA's housing prices, it's still a far cry from the original projections of how much the tax would raise. Early proponents of Measure LA estimated the tax would raise 900 million per year. In March, a report from the city administrative office lowered that number to 672 million. But once the tax took effect, LA's luxury market froze. Only 2 homes sold for more than 5 million in the month of April. And the market hasn't quite recovered since. Part of the blame can be placed on the overall state of the real estate market that's still hung over from historic pandemic sales and rising mortgage rates. But many luxury homeowners have simply decided to avoid the tax, either by refusing to sell their homes or hiring accountants and tax specialists to find loopholes. As a result, Mayor Karen Bass' first budget proposal, a $13.1 billion plan, projected only $150 million in revenue from Measure ULA. The $150 million mark is both a product of a slowing real estate market and an emergency backup plan in case the measure gets overturned. If it does, the city has to pay back all the funds raised by the tax. At the moment, The measure must overcome two major hurdles: an ongoing court case arguing that the tax is unconstitutional, and a state ballot measure that Californians will vote on next year. Barely begun, the court case has already seen its fair share of drama. Superior Court Judge Barbara Shepard recently became the third judge presiding over the case. The previous judge, Joseph Lipner, recused himself after one of the plaintiff's attorneys complained that he had a conflict of interest because he had previously worked at a law firm that represents Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing, The Real Deal reported. Meanwhile, the 2024 ballot measure called the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Tax would require 2/3 voter approval for new local special tax hikes dating back to January 2022, therefore dismantling Measure ULA, which received only 57% approval. Even if the measure is eventually overturned, the full $150 million will be spent, according to Council Member Bob Blumenfield. Well, there's a bit of a ... on that, but as I read it in some other articles, I think they've got some COVID money and some other money that they're going to replace if this all goes south to get to that $150 million. But yeah, what do you think of all that, man? Gosh.
Well, Joe, I think I have an opinion on it. I'll start there.
You do. I know you do.
Housing is not a human right, but we should all support making housing available and affordable and safe and healthy. And I think that's the proper language. I also think that it should be paid for by everyone, because you should not steal from one group of people to pay for it. The fact that the first thing they're spending money on, I do agree with, if they're going to spend the money, if they have the money, and that is assistance to people to keep them in their place. I have a huge issue, and that the reason is because at least it's covering a broader thing. It's maintaining stability. It's not saying someone's right or wrong. I think there should be a lot of guidelines as far as who they help. I don't think there are. I think if you're a tenant, they'll help you. Period.
Yeah.
And if you're a landlord, you're getting no support, no help. I think this particular mansionization tax and the source of these funds, what it always stands out to me, it really is, and what it's proven to be so far in the income it's generated, is that the uber wealthy will find a way to avoid taxes. And government is often not engaged enough, boots on the ground enough, to really navigate closing the loopholes that they continually find. They're not, because the uber wealthy have a lot of money to figure out how to do these things and pay people to figure out how to do these things. The simplest of components, fine. You might have a $6 million house. You're going to sell it for $4,995,000 and figure out a way to get that other million through another path or route, because it's a lot of money you're paying in taxes. And that's a simple route, but I'm sure there are a lot of ways they're figuring out how to do it. And I don't know, because I'm not selling at that price point by any means. It's not
our neighborhood. Yeah, it's not our neighborhood.
So I'll start with that, but here's who can't get around this stuff, and that is the middle class. Even the people who don't own rental property have absolutely no idea what it's like to be a landlord, even in the good times, and all the layers and all the sacrifices that are made, and we just keep getting thrown under the bus. And I support creating stability. I think everybody should pay for it equally across the board. I would support a single a sales tax to deal with this. But the issue then becomes the inefficiency of government and how much of it they're going to waste, how much of it is actually going to impact people and make their lives better. Certainly I'd feel even better paying it if it went directly to them and people who needed it. If I'm going to finish this off, sadly, all you have to do is be labeled a tenant. It's like, sometimes I wish I was a tenant rather than a landlord. I get a lot of empathy, I get free money, and no matter what, I could just proclaim victimhood. I'm not saying there aren't victims out there. I'm not saying there aren't aggressive landlords. But just to the divisiveness that this has created, because I had never spoken this way until COVID, until they basically put me as an aggressor. They put me in that role. as
Yeah.
soon as they made every tenant a victim.
Yeah.
And they continue to drive this wedge. They drive it all day. They keep hammering it, man, with
Yeah.
no awareness of
Yep.
the division they're creating in this space.
Yep.
It's going to blow up at some point. I don't know when. But I really do want affordable housing too. And I want good relationships between tenants and landlords, which I have been able to maintain because I am a reasonable person.
Right.
But I know a lot of people just struggle maintaining it. And part of that is the landlord, part of it's the tenant. So.
Well, we'll see. You know, I know this is like, I was reading, this is the third judge on this case. So hopefully there will be some tweaks to this. And like you said, a fair process to get this money. But yeah, a little too black, a little too white. There was another article, it was an LA Times article that maybe we'll share later, but definitely talking about your stance on mom and pops and the sacrifice and the work and the effort they really put into this. They are not big companies. And unfortunately, I think the latest number I heard about multi-units is sales are down 50%. And some of the stories of mom and pops were in this article. And, you know, one wife was a pattern maker. The husband, again, had a very humble job, but they saved up enough that 8 years ago they bought multi-unit in one building. And they just recently had to sell because they just couldn't afford it.
They weren't getting rent, and they couldn't evict.
Yeah.
And absolutely, it was their whole retirement plan was to have that building, and they lost it. And they put their money. They took their money to another state, where they didn't have all these restrictions.
Oh, you remember reading that, right? Yeah,
I do. And you know, the one thing that stood out in that article for me that is so unfair is that there was a moment where they tried to consider the struggle of the mom and pop landlord. Okay. They said, oh, okay, Mr. Mom and Pop landlord, yes, your prices have, you know, inflation has driven your costs up 7 to 10%. And your costs have gone up tremendously over the past 3 to 4 years, where we've said you can't raise rent a penny. So, and listen to this, and you'll see as I come full circle on this. They said, if you can prove to us you're losing money on the ownership of your building, we will allow you to raise your rents. And that was the one exception they carved out. I think there was good intention behind that. There's so many variables related to it that they didn't factor in. But, and here's my full circle, why isn't that way on the other end? Why is it that tenants don't have to prove that they can't afford a rent increase? Or they could just choose, you know, and I've seen this all the time. When they're applying for money, there's one of the two tenants saying, this is all the income we have in the household. They don't dive deeper to try to get an answer. It's equal. We all should be striving for more and better and being honest and decent. But this language, as I've struggled with, position of our government locally is one-sided.
Yep. All right. Well, there you go. We will continue to watch this and see what happens.